Hi, everybody. My name is Tanner Mortensen. I'm from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and I'm 22 years old. And recently, I've been put into contact with Brian, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity that Fathering Together has brought to me. So, a little bit about myself. I'm a former junior A hockey player. I played for 3 seasons in 5 different provinces in the span of those 3 seasons, and I had my fair share of struggles with mental health as well as alcohol abuse. Um, Living in all these different provinces and going through injuries, it's definitely takes a toll on your mental health, and that's kind of what this panel is going to be about. And it's going to provide different opportunities and solutions for people who are struggling. So recently, I've been sharing my story on TikTok, Instagram, and other platforms of social media, and I actually have my own fundraiser coming up to be that voice for those people that are struggling and they don't feel like they can talk to somebody, or they feel as if they are alone in this fight. But thank you again for joining us today. Fathering Together is providing a great opportunity for people to learn and to adapt different healthy ways into coping with their mental health.
Hi, my name's Mark Green. I want to welcome you to the Addressing Dad's Mental Health panel discussion. I'd like to note that we have a remarkable set of men here today who come from different approaches to the work. We have a healthcare professional, Jason Frischman, who is a therapist. We have Tom Matlack, who long ago founded the Good Men Project and who has been very much involved in the finance industry and whatnot. But a number of years ago, he ran into some serious mental health challenges and has since emerged on the other side, committed to helping men. And then we have Christopher Veal, who runs the Vulnerable Man podcast. I think all of us here come at this work with the idea that we're passionate about what's going on for boys and men, and we're passionate about the idea that when we connect in circles, when we connect in men's work, when we connect as fathers raising kids, we create the kinds of connection that we need in order to be healthier. So I will hand it over to Jason, who's just going to give you a little bit of background on what we're doing today and what we are not doing today. So Jason, take it away.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. So yeah, I've been a psychologist for 25 years, and these kinds of conversations are what I do every day, mostly all day. And I just, in thinking about these conversations and what you all will be hearing from us, I really just want to let everyone know this isn't medical advice, right? If we are giving any advice, it's to seek out medical advice if that's what you feel like you need to do after our conversation. Many of the things we're going to talk about may be difficult to hear. Maybe, I'm not sure where we're going to go, but they might be. And if that's the case, please take care of yourselves, right? Like I imagine you're going to be hearing this as a recording, so feel free to pause, take a few breaths, understand kind of where things are feeling in your body as you're listening to us. You might be excited and interested and engaged. Fortunately, it's a recording. Pause and come back to us, right? Like that's really important, because no matter how important or engaged the conversation that we have is, this is something where hopefully it's the beginning or the middle of your journeys. And so if you're hearing this information and you want to learn more, we're going to talk about resources. We're going to talk about kind of the path and the journey that we all take in men's work. So, certainly take care of yourselves. Know that we aren't coming. I'm not playing a role of a therapist in this conversation. I am a man. I'm going to channel my own story. And none of us are here to sort of offer you ways to fix things. We're going to share our own stories, and hopefully it'll resonate with you all.
Great. Thank you, Jason. The other thing that I want to say, and I think this is a sort of a universal truth, is that we as men have been trained all of our lives to sort of put a brave face on everything, to deny our own anxiety or the challenges we're feeling, to push that stuff down and to try to keep going along. And if you are a stay-at-home parent like I was, you're also caught up in the very real work of raising children and being present for them and being brave for them and being joyful for them and being there for them. So I want to make sure that everyone understands that we've got kind of a default switch that turns off our awareness of our own struggles. And if we are in conversation today about anything at all, it is to gently turn that switch on and check in with ourselves. And if you feel some panic rising or some concern rising, that's an indication that maybe some help is something that you'll need. And there's lots of ways to do that. So I'd like to start the conversation today with Tom Matlack. As I mentioned before, Tom's done a lot of really high level finance work, venture capital stuff. He's, by all arguments, has been a very successful man, and yet he collided with mental health issues in his own life and has since come out the other side committed to helping men. Tom, thank you for joining us today.
Awesome. I'm so excited to be here. This is really cool. So I'll just try and keep it brief. First and foremost, I have 3 kids who are 29, 27, and 18 who are awesome. And I have a wife of 20 years who's beautiful and who I adore. And so I'm a husband and a dad. Yeah, so my story goes, I should have died twice, basically. 26 years ago, I got sober. So I'm an addict, and have maintained my sobriety since December 28th, 1996. At that time, my life completely blew up. I had 2 baby children. My wife threw me out of the house, rightfully so. I got divorced. I lost everything except my professional life. I had been a CFO of a very large company at a very young age, and I just kept on going on. I mean, I started doing venture capital during the internet bubble and made all kinds of money. Started a venture capital firm, ran that for 10 years, and then started investing in private equity. And that whole time, certainly recovery helped a lot, especially at the beginning when I was paying attention and was humble. But my ego came back. I thought I was all that. And, I've been to the mountaintop. It's a lie. It does, success does not work. I started having panic attacks about 6 years ago, and about 5 years ago, it was a Monday morning. I was trying to meditate, and I realized that I couldn't meditate because I had a plan to kill myself that day. And I called my sister, who's a therapist. She was there. I was in Brookline. She was in Cambridge, Mass, and she was there in about 30 seconds. She walked me to the ER. I was hospitalized for 10 days in one facility, came out, was right back on her doorstep, no better. And eventually got a bed in McLean, which is, the best hospital in the world. And I spent over a month there. And at that point, I was completely surrendered. I had no idea. I didn't believe I could live, honestly. And they were giving me ECT, medicine, everything. And the story I like to tell is that the beginning of the journey back was when they do safety watches every 15 minutes, 24/7, which is a real pain in the ass. We try to sleep. And about 2 weeks in, my mindset changed, and I began to see that the people who were doing the safety checks, who I was resenting up to that point, were angels. They were taking care of me. They were keeping me alive. And at that point, every time they came in the middle of the night, it was greatly reassuring to me. It was like my mom pulling up the covers on my bed. And I stopped wanting to kill myself. I got out several weeks later, and I was still a mess. And this was 5 years ago. And I worked my butt off over the last 5 years, both in recovery and therapy, meditation, exercise, breath work, everything. And today I am as happy as I've ever been in my life. And it's not like I have the same kids, I have the same wife, I got the same dog who's right back there. I'm in the same house. I was sitting here, nothing has changed except my soul. My soul's changed. My mission I realized coming out of all that, like, you know, all the IPOs and all the deals and all the money and all that shit meant nothing. Absolutely nothing. And that my call had never really made me happy. It's always hollow. And I realized my calling was to help other men, to be in service. First to help men get sober, and now more widely as I kind of realized that there was guys who were not drunks, who are not alcoholics, just guys my age who are suffering just as badly as I am. And started doing, I mean, I'm not an expert like you guys, but I have looked at all the data, and it's horrible. Mostly around isolation. And so I try and facilitate in my work, like amplifying the problem and finding ways for men to connect. And, you know, I just get so much joy out of that. I mean, both as a, you know, on a group level, but then on a one-on-one level, like, you know, I do sponsor guys who have blown up their lives. And when you take, you know, a guy who's like completely hopeless, you know, just looks like dead in the eyes. And then not that long later, you know, you see joy in their eyes and life and hope. Like that is 1,000 times better than any freaking deal I ever closed. It's like, it's self-interest that's enlightened. And so I just keep trying to do that. And I have tried to begin to kind of amplify the messages that all of you have also been so great at amplifying, in terms of, we got a big problem, we got to work on it together. We got to bring men together. So that's my story.
All right. Thank you, Tom. I'm going to circle back to you. So here's something just to mull over as we continue the conversation. And I'm curious what was absent before that is present now, not in terms of your work toward other people, but just inside yourself when you do that work. What do you feel? But I want to jump over here to Christopher. Christopher, your podcast is called the Vulnerable Man Podcast. We hear the term vulnerable a lot, and I think for many men, they shy away from that idea because it sounds like opening yourself up to be bullied and to be victimized by a culture of masculinity, which is, by all accounts, pretty strict in terms of men being tough and hiding their emotions and doing all that stuff. So I'd love to hear how you arrived at the work that you're doing, and where you locate that meaning in your own life personally.
Right. Well, thank you. First of all, glad to be here, and I'm excited to hear what everyone else is bringing to this too, and grateful to connect with some other men that are in this conversation as well. So for me, vulnerability used to be a 4-letter word that I didn't utter in mixed company. And to give a little bit of context, I spent 9 years as an infantry officer in the Marine Corps. Got out of the Marine Corps, went into construction, and did 6.5 years there. So both very touchy-feely industries, if you know anything about it. Yes. And what I realized is, while I was successful in both of those roles, I never felt like I could really be myself. I had to put on like this idea of a mask and show up a certain way because that's the way that was expected and the way that people were supposed to behave and perform. And in 2014, early 2014, my mother was diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer. And that hit me hard. And she was not living. So I live in Southern California. I was married at the time with a daughter who was young. And my mother lived up in Canada, in Alberta. And so I was working full time, trying to be a husband and a father, trying to be a caring son, flying back as often as I could to take care of my mother, who I'm an only child as well, and trying to balance all that. And I burned myself out. And through it all, I kept that stereotypical male mindset of, I got to get this done. Like, I got to do it. I can't ask for help. You know, it's all on me, and all that BS. That's the story we tell ourselves. She passed away in December of that year, and it wiped me out. Like, I crashed hard. And it was shortly after that I started going back to therapy. I had done it years earlier, and I realized I can't do this anymore. I wasn't able to take care of my wife at the time. I wasn't able to show up the way I wanted to be as a father. And so that story where they talk about on the airplane, like, put your mask on before assisting others, I'd ignored it completely for so long because I had that mentality of, hey, you know what? Suck it up, mission accomplishment. And so in 2015, it was really that turning point for me. And I also started doing a year-long leadership program that I took part in. But what came out of that was this idea that I wanted to expand this conversation around men and vulnerability, because I didn't know really what my relationship with it was, other than I kept it at arm's length and there's no way I'm going to let it anywhere near me. And I started interviewing men and talking with them one-on-one in mid 2016. And the more men that I talked to, the more I realized, first, it was expanding the way that I was looking at vulnerability. Also, how there were a lot of similarities that other men that I talked to about. And I was really curious for them, what got in the way of being vulnerable with other men in particular. And it would be stories like, I didn't want to be seen as less than or weak or not manly enough, whatever that is. And then I would ask them the question often of, if your best friend came up and shared something with you that he was struggling with, how would you think of him? And every single one of those men would say, you know what, I'd have so much more respect for him, or I'd be proud of him, or I'd feel proud that he reached out to me. And then I would sit back and wait for the light bulb to come on. And suddenly they go, oh, and they realize that when they saw vulnerability in others, it was a strength or an asset. But when they thought of it in themselves, that they judged themselves, there was shame, there was all that. So I set all that up because as I was having those conversations one-on-one, I realized there's a lot more men that need to hear this. And I say men, and I'm speaking in a binary sense, and I know we are beyond that in our world. But I realized there were a lot of men that were falling into this old, outdated view of what it meant to be a man and masculinity, much like I had grown up in. And I knew I wanted to have more men hear those stories about where the men struggled and succeeded or failed or whatever it was. Because the more we see examples of what masculinity can be and how it's more expansive than the narrow definition most of us grew up with, the more it normalizes it. And one of the beautiful gifts that came out of it is there were a number of men that would often talk about how they found using therapy or counseling or reaching out and connecting with others was the catalyst for really being able to step into greater vulnerability. And so I decided it was time to create a podcast. I knew nothing about it. I had to be vulnerable and reach out to my network. And a good friend of mine said, I've been doing this for years. Excuse me, let me help you. And so it was born. And, you know, I'm on a quest to destigmatize the word vulnerability for men so that we can be in better relationship with ourselves and our world. And that's how it started. And honestly, I was scared out of my wits to even call it the vulnerable man, because I thought, first of all, what guys are going to want to come on this show and talk about it? And who's going to listen to it? Fortunately, the universe has said Christopher did the right thing. And, you know, it's gotten a lot of traction and it's helping to expand the conversation. So that's what brought me to this point. And I'm always excited to be connected with other men that are talking about this and helping us shift the narrative as well.
So that's beautiful. I just want to invite any man or woman or non-binary person who's listening to this conversation right now to check in with yourself and see if the little voices or the little sensations inside your body are resistant to what Tom talked about or resistant to what Christopher talked about, or whether this feels like something you could lean into a little more. I think also one of the things that has hit me time and time again in my own life is, yes, I want to lean into this, and I don't know anyone. I don't know anyone who's doing it. My friends don't do this. I feel completely unable to figure out where I would reach out to or where I would go next in order to try and create these kinds of conversations in my life. So I also want to get to that piece, but I'd like to hear your thoughts and your own journey in this work, Jason. So take it away.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I had thought about how I wanted to share my story here, and it's sort of gone out the window because I'm just struck by hearing what everyone's been talking about. And I always think in terms of words and themes and things like that. And clearly, the theme of connection is powerful and essential. And you know, in thinking about this, I looked up, I'm a big word dork, and I always have been. I like stories, and words are sort of the currency of stories, many of which. I looked up the etymology of vulnerable, right? It comes from wound, right? And so to me, there's this space, and that goes into some of my story, right? Like coming from a family, you know, growing up in New York, I had two very present and wonderful parents. You know, my mom was a teacher, my dad was a social worker. There was lots of love, and I'm very blessed and privileged to have this wonderful growing up. And yet there was still wounding, right? There was still being a male in New York and being different, having long hair, being sensitive, you know, all of these things, being Jewish. there was a lot of difference. And, there was a lot of, I was the recipient of a lot of the bullying and the like elements of you're different, not good. And so for me, it was always, I call, myself and guys that I've worked with, smart and sensitives, right?
Mhm.
Because in our world, if you're smart and sensitive, you're not really all that accepted, right? If you're smart and insensitive, you can be a type A, corporate exec. And if you're dumb but very sensitive, you're a lovable oaf. We love guys like in one of those categories.
Right.
But if you're somewhere in the middle, it's a problem, right? And so I've always grown up loving stories and loving the ideas that stories in our life direct and model our lives. And so over the years, I'm a big Star Wars fan. I like Lord of the Rings. I like, those kind of things. And so I found naturally a story called The Hero's Journey. And spent years, I have it over here, but I wrote my dissertation from the metaphor of the hero's journey, and spent years working in therapy supporting men and boys and families around this journey. And then came to this realization probably about 10 years ago that actually, and I really believe this, is that this hero's journey story that is everywhere, it's in every movie, it's in every book, it's actually really damaging. And it supports this sort of men's old school traditional men's culture, because if I'm not epic, if I'm not legendary, if I'm not whatever, then what am I, right?
Mm.
And this idea, so we've heard from both Tom and Christopher about their missions, right? Both themes about connection, but mine was my mission really has become elevating our everyday mundane life and finding the adventures in every day. And so working with men who, might have grown up desiring, or at least being shown, that in order to be great and a hero, you've got to go off and battle dragons and save the universe. And now they're like stuck, wiping butts and doing the dishes, right? How do we find meaning and make meaning and value in our every single day and move away from the hero's journey as the sole story for men? Right. And, to me, this really got solidified in two very distinct times. One was when my second son was born. I'm a husband and a partner and a father to two boys. They're 3 years apart. So when my second son was born, I had a 3-year-old. And my wife took me aside and very naturally said, I'm going to say this once, but I want to get it out. I would have liked a girl, so that we had a boy and a girl. That's, natural. It makes sense. 2 days later, she overheard my infant son kind of cooing in my lap. And then my 3-year-old and I were singing to him. And she pulls me back in. And this time she's still crying. And she says, I take back what I said. We were meant to raise boys. And I took that to heart, right? Like, not only am I meant to raise my own two sons, but I want to be a part of raising masculinity, raising men. And so then years later, as I've been working as a therapist for 25 years. I see guys in my office, and one after another and after another. And a couple of years before the pandemic, I'm sitting with a guy in my office who's talking about feeling isolated, not having friends, all of those things. And I know that in my waiting room, truly, literally on the other side of the door, my next client would be this guy's best friend. And I'm truly legally not even allowed to introduce them because of the bounds of therapy. Right. And so I ran a therapy men's group for years, and I did all that. But so I definitely encourage both of them to join their group so I could sort of maneuver it. But, at the time, that's really where I find that's the moment where sort of my coaching program and the work that I do now was born, because I wanted to have the flexibility to be like, hey, you guys, come on, let's talk. I want to introduce you. You go, and so building community and building connection became pretty much the foundational element of all the work that we do, because, we can get through all the other stuff, right? Like, we talk about feeling happy, feeling joy. I want us to feel. I tell people all the time, it's not my job to help you feel better. It's to help you feel.
Amen.
And so that's the work that I think is really important. And Mark, to your point, what I would invite all the listeners is really take a moment. What are you feeling? What are you feeling hearing this? Is it sort of like back, or are like, think about your body. Are you leaning into the screen? Are you sitting back into the screen? Like, what's this mean? Because I'll just end in saying, like, for a long time I said, vulnerability is the new strength, and I think that's something that how we connect with one another becomes the strength that we're able to then deal with all of the stuff in mundane everyday life. It creates meaning.
I'm going to take my turn real quick to just talk about what brought me into this work. And I have to say that, what really began to wake me up in my life was when my son was born 17 years ago. And I found myself blogging about what it meant to be a stay-at-home dad. I was both I've always been a contractor working from home. So I was generating revenue and also helping take care of my son. He was in my life every day, all day. And, when you show up at the kids' park at noon on a Wednesday with a child, and there's no other dads there, and the women are looking at you, you're literally signaling, "Way to go, son. Good job, son." You're signaling to your kid constantly so that they won't think you're just some guy sitting in the kids' park. You begin to get all kinds of messages culturally about what it is to be an engaged primary caregiving dad in this world. And back then, the stay-at-home dads movement was completely under the radar. People didn't know they existed. And when corporate America got wind of it, they started making movies like Mr. Mom and started making TV commercials about dads dropping their kids, because they didn't know how to raise children. And there was this whole big joke that men as caregivers were out there somehow embarrassing themselves. And it doesn't take long looking at that culture. And by the way, the dads got together, they created organizations, they gave a lot of pushback. They started reaching out to advertisers and saying, "You got to stop doing this stuff, man. We are perfectly capable of taking care of our kids." But as you start to look at that, you begin looking at the larger culture, which I did. But the other thing ultimately, so I began writing about masculinity and doing all this other stuff for the Good Men Project. But eventually you also just have to look at yourself. And while caring for my son taught me a lot about who I am, it didn't do anything to address the wounds I had as a child, and the stuff I was carrying. So half a century into my life, I was staring down the barrel at my second divorce. I had gone through a phase of drinking ridiculous amounts of alcohol. I had done all of these coping strategies and all of these efforts to try and make a life based on the rules of manhood as I understood them, right? Which is, don't show your emotions, always be tough, always be a leader, make a lot of money, have a lot of sex, have control over women and girls. If you're going to have conversations with other guys, make them about cars or sex or whatever. Don't make it about anything deep. And I had been doing my best at that. And I had gotten a couple of mortgages, gotten married a few times, bought some cars, whatever it was. But ultimately, I kept failing. Things kept falling apart. And the relationships in my workplace and in my personal life, I would get almost to some sense of whatever, and then they would just dissipate. Because I was playing this character of what it meant to be a man instead of the full, rich version of a human being that we are when we step outside these narrow rules of what it means to be a man. So I'm failing in marriages. I'm losing clients. I'm struggling, and eventually, my solution was to go do some men's work. And I'd been writing about masculinity and was getting some notoriety. And my friend Boyson Hodgson of the Mankind Project said, "Hey, why don't you come do a weekend?" And I was like, "No way, dude. I'm not, no way you're getting me into that weird cult. Forget it, And additionally, I had this thing where I would never be a member of any organization that would have me as a member. That's a Groucho Marx idea. Mm-hmm. But eventually I said, I'm writing about masculinity. I probably should go do this. Meanwhile, year after year leading up to that, I had gone down to the basement, my own internal self. And down there, this big cellar door, with chains on it. And I would go down and I'd say, okay, this year I'm going to go do my work. I'm going to go figure out why I always feel anxious, why I always feel like people don't really get me, why I always feel this sense that I'm not enough, I'm not making enough money, I'm not having enough sex, I'm not doing whatever I need to be doing enough of to feel like I finally achieved it, like I got to where I wanted to be in this idea of being a man. I'd go down there, and the chains would start rattling and the screaming would start, this horrible thing on the other side. And I would be like, nope, not this year. Go back up the stairs. And I think many men have this version of themselves. In my case, it was the childhood version of me that was wounded and pissed off and really angry. And until I did my men's work, where, interestingly enough, I walk out onto the carpet at the Mankind Project, and it's my turn to say what my issue is. And I'm looking at 40 men and they're all looking back at me. And the words that come out of my mouth are, based on my life and the men in my own family. I don't like men. I don't trust men. I hate men. And I'm sick to death of being alone. And I'm weeping in front of these guys. And they look back at me and they say, well, you want to try trusting us? And I'm like, what do I have to lose? Fine, I'll try. And what I discovered was it's a rare thing when you enter a room with men who actually do want to hear your stories and actually do want to hear what's going on for you and actually do want to share what's going on for them. But when you find that place, and I think one of the terms we use for it is being vulnerable. But when you find a place where men aren't judging you on a pecking order of dominance, who makes the most money, who's got the most clout, when you're in a room with men who care about your story, it's like breathing for the first time. It's like, and in that process of doing that work, this thing in the basement, I also called it a stone, it cracked, and I was able to start looking at parts and pieces of it and start building myself a better sense of who I really wanted to be instead of this caricature I've been playing all my life. And eventually I went down to that basement, and I'll finish with this. I did open that door, and I went to that kid down there, that 8-year-old who was absolutely full of rage. And I said to him, I said, buddy, you shouldn't have had to go through what you went through. No, and I'm sorry I wasn't here for you. Somebody should have been here for you, and nobody was. But I'm here now, and I'm going to take care of you. And you come on up the damn stairs and so he's still here. He sits next to me sometimes and he raises all kinds of hell. But I just put my arm around him and I say, he's part of who I am. I don't need to fear him. I don't need to lock him away. I don't need to hide from him. And so our work in vulnerability, our work in men's work, our work as men is to get back to who we really are instead of playing these caricatures. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So what does this bring up for you guys? Who wants to carry?
Yeah, I'll
this?
jump in. I have thoughts. We could talk about this forever, but I had a couple quick hits. I love the idea of the hero's journey being not what it's set out to be. Kind of story of my life. I was a hero. Everyone looked up to me. Made all the money. I was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal at one point, and it sucked. I was hollow. I was dead inside. One of the things I ask guys who I work with is, who are your heroes? And, for me, for most of my life, it would have been, Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or some athlete. And, at this point, it's, I can think of two men who you don't know, who have a depth of spirituality that I admire and who love me unconditionally. And who I'm, deeply connected to, and who help me be a better person. They're my heroes. So there's been a complete shift on vulnerability. I'm like a vulnerability evangelist. I like to go where no man has gone before with vulnerability. So like the story I like to tell is my wife grew up going to this beach club in Westport, Massachusetts, which is one of these little Yankee beach communities that have like 200 families. And if you weren't born there, you're not going to get a house there, and you're not going to be part of this rinky-dink country club. And she likes to go to these cocktail parties where everyone gets smashed. And as a sober alcoholic and introvert, I hate it, couldn't stand it. I just sit in the corner and judge people. And then a couple of years ago, it occurred to me, the way it goes at these things is like the guy tells you like how successful he is, how much money, literally how much money. It shocks me. Like one of my friends tells me, straight out, like, this is how many millions of bucks I got. And then after he's done asserting his dominance, he's like, and what do you do? Like, you poor thing. And and so and it used to like bum me out. Like, and so then I decided that I was going to change up the script. And so I started saying, I help guys get sober. That's what I do. And you can see in their eyes, they take a beat. They're like, huh. Because I've just gotten vulnerable. Like, that is not what anyone fucking says at a cocktail party. And 90% of the guys, 10% of the guys just walk away. 90% of the guys take a beat and they say, oh shit, we're not going to play this game anymore. And then they say, my dad died of alcoholism. My brother is a meth addict. I've struggled with addiction. They have some story to talk about what's really fucking going on. And we have the most amazing conversations. I actually love going to these events because it allows me to connect authentically with people who are dying for it. So that's my story on vulnerability. In terms of like how I kind of got to where I am now, like coming out of the psych ward and all that, recovery does a really, really good job in terms of, it did a really good job for me of getting me to really understand myself and going out and reconnecting with the people that I had harmed through my addiction, making amends and healing. So it got me from self-pity and terror to self-esteem and joy, and really enjoying my life, with one exception, which is I still could not handle sexual intimacy. Couldn't handle it. And it would just show up in ways that, like, I would act inappropriately. Nothing terrible, but it would cause me to suffer because I knew that it wasn't the right thing. I wasn't going to get what I really wanted. And I had this beautiful wife. So I had to, those wounds, I had to like go back and explore those wounds. And, for me, like, a lot of therapy, like one thing that actually like really helped, which surprised me, was I do a very intense form of breath work, which is kind of like taking LSD, but without the LSD. It places you in a precise moment in your history with an amazing amount of detail, and often things that I had repressed that I didn't remember, or I would have like glanced over. It turns out I have, some very, very significant sexual abuse in my history, and I had to work through that. And we had our 20th wedding anniversary last December, and I don't know, a switch went off. I was like, wow, my wife is so awesome, and she's so hot, and like, I don't have to run. Like, I can be all in on this. And so that was like the last part of my healing. Was to actually figure out how to be a husband and how to be in love with my wife.
I want to just step in here and point to something that's really important for any man, woman, again, non-binary person listening to this conversation. Tom's doing what Tom does, which is admitting to something that most of us have experienced. Not some of us, most of us. And until we get to a place where we say, yeah, and in my own history, I had a relationship with my brother, he's a year and a half older. That person never got off me, never got off my ass, I have memories of him pinching me in the baby pool, but later there were things that he did, which to this day, I'm not entirely sure were exclusively boys being boys. There was something else going on there. And the reason I know it is because I can still, this is going to sound a little strange, but I can still smell him. I can still remember the scent of him, which means he's too close, way too close on a 3, 4, 5-year-old boy. And for him, I think it was just dominance, but it was physical dominance on a level that that stayed with me. And I have to own that. I have to figure out what that means, right? In terms of my relationship with other men, with the women in my life, with my own son. And so I would ask every man out there to just what Tom talked about, how we gloss over things, how we just skip past stuff. Part of our work to find our real connection in the world is to get in connection with ourselves, with our authentic self, which we have often shut down and not listened to. Anybody else? What do you got?
Something I want to throw in there as we're talking about this is I think one of the reasons that we struggle with intimacy is because, and I'll speak here in North America, we've collapsed intimacy with sex. And they're actually separate things. And for me, over the last several years, I've really understood and come to better understand what intimacy means to me, that it's separate from the physical act of sex and even love. That transformed things for me. And I can be intimate with people that I'm not in romantic relationships with. And I'm okay with it. I also know that sometimes people get weirded out by it. So I have to be careful. But I think that's an important thing we need to understand, because for many years, I was like this. I wanted intimacy so badly, but I was afraid of it, that I would keep it at arm's length. And I think the more we talk about it, help men understand what it means really for us and what we want, then we can start to have the conversation to ask for what it is. Because there's also this idea of, there's only certain things that I should want or ask for. And otherwise, if I don't, there's something wrong with me. And let's just throw all that crap right out the window, because what is normal anyways, really? Yeah.
I just want to add this, and then I'll go over to Jason. My experience of intimacy through most of my life was I want intimacy and I'm a piece of shit. So I was this, I self-denigrated, I begged, I pleaded, I apologized for my need for intimacy, and I apologized for the way that I acted in intimate situations, especially sexual ones. But even just friendship, I'm a piece of garbage, but would you be my friend? And that comes directly from a culture of masculinity, which trains us out of some of our greatest strengths and our most authentic aspects of who we are, and makes us play this caricature. And no wonder we come out of it feeling very low self-esteem. So if you're a man who wants to reach out to another man for friendship, but you feel ashamed of who you are, welcome to the world. This is what our dominant space culture of masculinity has trained us into. Jason, what do you got?
Well, a lot, but I go back to, again, the balance between connection and self inner work, right? I loved your metaphor and very real story of I don't know if you said 9 or 10-year-old in the basement, right? You had to know yourself well enough to know he was down there and all of that. But, traditional psychology, which in many ways, I think, actually, this is a whole other conversation, but I think traditional psychology propagates and promotes some of the patriarchal dominant thinking. So it's hard, but it often it puts all of the problems in us, right?
Yeah.
And yet what your story said was, I recognized what was in me, and then I connected with how people outside of me, which then allowed me to go back into the basement, right? And so that balance between the two is so important. And often we start by saying, well, I've got to, I got to get to the core of me. I got to go do this. And yet, kind of like what I said when I introduced myself, is introducing 2 guys in my office was going to be 1,000 times more therapeutic than anything I was going to do.
Yeah.
Right. Or at least it was going to open up anything I was going to do. And so to me, that is so important. But I think about my own sort of story when you said about intimacy and sex, right? The combination of intimacy with sex and all of these stories about who we should be. We're entitled to sex. I'm a good guy, so I should get more sex. And, I think about it in my youth, I tried to get as much sex as I possibly could, telling myself, but I'm a good guy. I'm not, I'm not cheating. I'm not using anyone. I'm still a good guy. I listen to the people that I have sex with. But it was really trying to get and obtain and dominate as much as I possibly could. And, the work had to be like, where did those wounds come for me? What is that drive, and what is that fear, and how do I name it? Right. I think the other piece that I really sort of was struck by was like, and we've all been doing it, is how do we name things? Right. If we don't name it, we don't know what it is. If we don't have words for things, we can't experience them in the same way. We can't describe them, and we certainly can't connect about them because we can't even talk about it. And so even, in some of the work that I'll do, or even in my own life, I don't care about, I used to have it right here, but like the diagnostic manuals, right? Like, what do we call a psychopath? I don't care. Call it whatever you want. And then we have a language, as long as we know what it is. And so whether it's, talking to my guy, myself in the basement, or my mixed up monster, or whatever it is, when we have a name for it, and then we can name it. And what wonderful things happen. We were talking a little bit about what the wonderful thing happens when men who are open and willing get together, is that they create a language together. They create, like, there is a culture in the small group of men that allows for more opening, because now we have words. Now we have words for it. What does vulnerable mean? What does it mean to you? Oh shit, it makes me scared. Okay, well, let's figure out what that is. And how do we do, unless we name things, it is, it's like you turn the light on in the closet or under the bed. And until you turn that light on, it's going to be scary.
Yeah. I want to
Right.
also say that Tom pointed to something really important, and that is that he walks into cocktail parties and talks to people about getting sober. And the idea would be, well, they're going to run him out on a rail, right? Get the fuck out of here. We're having a cocktail party. What he discovered instead is that many men are at a tipping point. They're right there. All they want is someone to just start the conversation. So if you're a man and you're thinking, okay, I have work to do, and that's tempting to individualize it. Our culture individualizes it. And we end up being so self-obsessed in terms of the solution. I've got to do my work, that we don't understand that Tom creates the work when he walks up to any man and says, tell me something authentic. And the same thing is happening with Christopher, and the same thing's happening with Jason. So if you're afraid to start because you think all the men around you aren't going to have that conversation, just know that we're all at this tipping point, and we've all been convinced that all the men around us don't want to have it, when in fact,
Yes.
out of that group of men that we know, a certain number of them are going to be ready to talk in those ways. The other thing that you need to know is that there is a very real health impact for isolation, for disconnection. Niobe Way has a book called Deep Secrets, which talks about the way in which boys' relationships are intentionally broken in dominance-based masculine culture through the denigration of the feminine. So every day, every hour, the boys around us, what are you, a sissy? What are you, gay? Whenever we show emotion or too much need for connection. But she has a study, and I told Tom about this a while back. 700 people or so in Northern Europe, they did a study with these folks, and what they discovered was, if you have a good marriage, if you have a partnership that's functional, whatever, or if you're completely alone, you face significantly higher levels of heart disease risk, and it'll kill you. That it's not enough to have a partner, but if you, a man, woman, non-binary person, have a meaningful circle of friends, then your heart disease numbers drop. So we need to see the direct connection between our physical health and our social connection.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the Harvard longitudinal study on that is really, really good too. I wanted to comment on a couple things. First, it's actually much better if the guy at the cocktail party has a martini in his hand. And these are guys who are like, you'd think are the hardest nut to crack. I wanted to go back to what Chris was talking about in terms of sex and intimacy. I think it's really important. It's important to me. For me, I had so much shame about my sexuality that it took on like this huge meaning well beyond what it really, should have. But it caused me to act very poorly. So like my poor first wife, who I've made amends with and I'm now really close to, I cheated on her before we got together, during we got together, and at the end, she threw me out for cheating on her, and on the way out the door said, hey, and by the way, you're drunk, and if you ever want to see these kids again, you're going to need to get sober. Thank God she said that. But in doing, work, the part that's in some ways so sad to me, in my experience, is when I was cheating on my wife, I was having affairs with women. I suppose we were getting naked. We were not having sex. We were talking. That's what the intimacy is, what I craved. Inappropriately, totally inappropriately. But I was literally the guy who goes into the strip club and pays the girl $1,000 to sit there and talk all night. It wasn't actually the sex that I wanted. It was the intimacy. And so when I work with guys now, are supposedly drunks, we say that it's really not about the drinking; it's the spiritual malady. And when you stop drinking is when the work starts. Inevitably, there's issues around sex and around money, and 99% of these guys are acting out in those ways, and we have to try and process that and get to a point of self-esteem and self-love through the recovery process. But it's just so painful to watch. Guy I've been working with forever, like, calls me and says, "Oh, I didn't go into the massage parlor this time." He never told me he'd ever been to one. And I was like, "This time?" And I said, "How does it feel when you walk out of there, man?" And he's like, "Look, it feels like shit. I feel so horrible about myself."
I want to go to Christopher.
Yeah,
I want to throw something in here real quick, Christopher, and then I'm handing it over to you.
Yeah.
Men listening to this, you have to understand, when you have no self-esteem, when you've been taught to play a caricature that's supposed to be about making money and power and strength, you become transactional in that moment. You don't say, "Here's my authentic self. Here's who I am." You say, "I'll get you a mortgage. I'll get you a new car if you'll have sex with me." We have transactional relationships with our children, with our wives, with the people at work, and then we wonder why we don't feel authentically connected. Christopher.
Well, I think this points to an underlying thing that I think back to as a kid. As a young boy, nobody talked to me about what intimacy was. I didn't even know. And what's really important is, I think the more we start to normalize that boys and young men can ask for it and talk about it, and it doesn't make them wrong. Like, I think that's where we start to make some traction as well, because I'm going to be 52 this year. And probably for the first 45 years of my life, I didn't know what intimacy was. But this conversation also making me think about, like, Jason, when you talked about naming it. So the other day, my daughter, who's 13, is educating me on some of the slang that kids use. And one of them is Riz, or somebody's got W Riz. I'm like, "What's that?" And she says, "Well, so if the boys are good at getting girls, they mean they got Riz, they got W Riz." And I said, and so we had to have a conversation that I'd like to say went better than it did, but I had to step into it and say, first of all, girls are not property that get got, right? But we had to have a conversation around that. But I bring it up because even in 8th grade, there's this story the boys are getting now. They're like, "Oh, to be the cool kid, I got to get girls," right? As you talked about, Mark, that dominance type culture. And I know it happens, but it was a way that it really hit home for me that I hadn't really connected the dots. And it scares me. Like, I'm raising a solid, strong young lady, but the fact that messaging is already there, like, those boys, how long are they going to have to take to deprogram what's already happened there? And that's what scares me about this.
I want to also note that if you're listening to this, gentlemen, Tom Matlack tells a story of a pretty hard crash, but this is not a conversation for people who crash hard. This is a conversation for all of us. You need to listen to the messages about authentic human connection. The other thing about this transactional piece that we're all usually engaging in, when you say, "I didn't understand intimacy," that's the you're in the transactional space, because you're trying to buy what you need, but you don't believe you deserve it just because of that you're going to show up in a real way. And it also means that, here, I'm going to give you this because I don't want to give you real respect, real connection, real vulnerability. But think of it as your authentic self, the human being that you were when you were 4 or 5 years old, and running around with the boys that were your best friends and saying every day, "I'm going to go create an afternoon of just golden joy and connection." We all remember what that felt like. That person is still there, waiting to be brought back into your life to say, "No more transactions. This is me. I'm here." And we can all get there, but you have to absolutely have to do the single step, which is to make the choice that I'm going to stop pretending that guys like Tom crash hard, but I don't. And that everything's okay for me. And I've still got this, even though people are looking at us a little sideways. No more sideways, man. Get with them. Get with people in connection. So,
yeah. So two things I want to add is the first part is, even there are, in my line of work, there are people who didn't even have that at 4 or 5, right? At 4 or 5, there was already life circumstances that were, that were hurting, that were harming, that were, all of those things. And so even for the guys who may say, well, yeah, even that isn't my experience, all of us here, I think, have seen and know, can testify that even if you don't necessarily have that, there is something in you. There's something in you that can find meaning, that can find value. We can always up-level our characters. And I think that is an absolute, truism. I don't believe in a lot of universal truths, but that's one of them, is that we can up-level our characters, and it takes work, but that work can be joyful. It should be joyful. There's a lot of fun that is absolutely necessary in order to do this work. So for any of the guys, truth is, if you're like, I'm going to step into this work and the work's not fun, and I don't mean always, but if there aren't elements of fun to the work, keep looking, like there will be, like we can make that happen. But the other piece that I really wanted to point out that I think is really, it's super powerful is this idea of cultural stories of men and how we're getting these lessons, 8th grade already, all of this, you mentioned Mr. Mom and movies, like so much, again, going back to Hero's Journey, and so much of the stories that we get in popular media impact how we see ourselves. So I think about this, and, Mark, you and I mentioned this a few days ago, but like there's an entire genre of movies called bromance movies that inherently grounded in homophobia, patriarchal dominant thinking, that puts down having friendships, right? Like, I was able to be a dad bringing kids to the playground as well. And I remember, I wanted to like get a tattoo on my head that says, I know I'm a guy, but I'm okay. I was running around playing with my kids and other kids wanted to join in. And I was like, am I allowed to do that? Like, our mom's going to think I'm weird. I still feel like when I'm with my 2 kids who are 15 and 12, I still feel like, are people going to see me as like, oh, good, that's the separated dad who's getting his visiting hours with his kids? And I'm like, no, this isn't it. And so, having an awareness and identifying big cultural stories is really important. Again, it goes back to these connections. And like, if we identify them, if we know them, again, if we name them, then we can step back and say, do I want to continue to buy into this?
Yeah.
And so, my going back to guys want this or need this, or we really can use this. I have had so many, it's heartbreaking, so many guys in my office, more than I can count, who would be the first to say, I have buddies. I would hang out with guys. But then they're going to say, and I've literally heard this exact sentence from a lot of guys, if my wife left me, I'd have no one to tell. Same guys who say, I go out with my buddies all the time. And so this idea of what do guys, I was recently on a podcast about mental health in men, and they said, what should the women who are listening know about the men you're working with? And my first thought was that men want connections. We want this. And it's so hard because if we don't know it, I hope that listening to this opens something up for people, because I actually believe we want this even when we don't know we want this, right? Like there's a drive for connection that is more powerful, but it has been pushed for decades, for centuries, and it isn't sort of the natural way of things. The story that we've been told, there's a long history of where that came from and how that goes, but we don't have, I think someone said earlier, tipping point, right? I really have hope that we're at that, right? Like a conversation like this wasn't happening 30, 40, 50 years ago. And I hope that we're better for it. I hope my children are better for this conversation.
I think one way to kind of self-diagnose on the social connection piece, I go back to that Harvard study, which I just found so interesting. The way they've been studying since 1950 or 1938 to now, so 85 years of data. And so they track all this stuff to try and figure out mortality, basically. And they define social connection as how many people in the middle of the night could you call if you had a big problem, or you just were upset. And so they've tracked that number since 1938. And for men, it started going down with the advent of TV in 1950. And then it kind of gradually went down, and then it went over a cliff like this. And so, men die 6 years younger than women. And it's because of, 4 times as many suicides, 70% of the drug overdoses. But they're able to go through the data and say, for cancer, right? What's the biggest causation of cancer? Is it obesity? Is it smoking cigarettes? Is it, not exercising? Or is it social connection? And it's social connection. Like, if you want to not catch cancer, get a friend. Don't stop smoking. That's the issue.
Well, here's what I want to double click on everything that you're both are saying. Like, for anybody that's listening to this, for the men especially, like, be the first one to go out and reach out. Don't wait for someone to do it. Amen. Because if you and your buddy are both sitting there waiting, you're in this endless like chess match. Be the one to say, like Tom does, hey, I do this, and goes vulnerable first. I do that a lot as well. But reach out and say, you know what? I'd love to have a different kind of conversation. Can I share something that's going on? Like, open up.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it. There's a guy named Ray Arata who founded the Better Man Conference. And when he does work with men, they say, how do you get men to open up? And he says, I go first. I have to go first. So if you have, I'm completely with Christopher here. You got to go to the men in your circle, and you got to take a risk, and you got to connect. You got to say, I got something going on. I want to share it with you. It could be something really positive. It could be something really negative. It could be a challenge you're facing, but whatever it is, it's not standard operating conversation, right? Yeah. The other thing
can I add one thing on that, Mark?
Yeah, go for it.
When you do that, you can also let them know, I don't need you to fix anything. Because sometimes, like, we feel like, oh, my friend is hurting, I got to do something. And even just telling them up front, hey, I just want to tell you this, can you just listen? And that's it. Like, helps them be able to receive it a little more without feeling like, oh no, Christopher's struggling, what do I do with that? I don't need you to do anything, just listen.
Beautiful. It's an essential part that, because we are social. Another thing we're socialized to do is fix things, right? And so that's essential. And the piece, Mark, I want to say, you said go to your circle. A lot of men don't have circles, or they think they don't, or whatever. So let's even say your circle could be one other human. It doesn't have to be a circle.
Yeah. And you can look for organizations, you can look for therapists, you can start with books or podcasts to sort of explore how to begin moving into connection. We're at the 1 hour mark, and I would like to invite each of you to just give us your final thoughts, and also some information about how to find you.
Yeah, I'll go first. Let's get some solutions. One thing I want to mention is I've become involved in an organization called F3. It's Fitness, Fellowship, and Faith. I just got involved in it, but like, they're so awesome. It's 75,000 men across the country meeting in groups of 20 or less to do a workout, but mostly have fellowship and non-denominational faith. And just go. It's all over the country. They have a Finder app on the website. Go to F3 and try it out. So, like, if you're one of those people who doesn't have anyone in their life, just go, and they're going to embrace you with love, and they're gonna have the ability to kind of meet you where you are. So try that out. Second thing, I've been doing this speaker series on Sunday night, which is open to everybody. They're just inspirational guys who give a 30-minute talk, and then we have 30 minutes of sharing afterwards. It's been really awesome. But the speakers have been great. The sharing has been even greater. So I'm sure we can put that in the notes somewhere.
Yep.
The last thing is you can find me. I do all my content on Substack these days, and it's just Thomas Matlack on Substack, and Matlack, all one word. So check me out there.
Excellent. Christopher?
Sure. So if you want to find the Vulnerable Man podcast, you can find it where you get all your podcasts, but the website is vulnerable-man.com. So I invite you to check that out. I'm going to be reaching out to some of these guys, to be honest. As a matter of fact, Mark will be very soon.
I also 2 hours from now.
I know, right? 2 hours, but I didn't want to ruin the surprise because they won't see this recording first. So it'll already be out by then. But anyhow, I also wrote a book around this subject too called The Whole Man, Evolving Masculinity. And so if people want to check that out, they can go to wholemanjourney.com. And always happy to connect with people in other places, but you can also find me on LinkedIn, and you'll know you found the right Christopher Veal because I have Vulnerability Vanguard in my tag.
Wonderful. Jason?
So the first thing I want to say is, I'll tell about my work in a minute, but there are men's groups everywhere. And I know of 2 or 3 right now that are starting up to try to get, chapters all over the country, different countries in Ireland, all these things. And so, sure, find me, please. But if not, find the group that resonates with you. They are, I think I live in rural Vermont, and I think there's 3 different men's groups in this area, and so I really want to encourage anyone, do that work and get connected in one way or another, because as we've been saying, it becomes really important and fun, right? So my work is I have a program called The Journeyman. And it is really, in many ways, I host a virtual inn where men can come in and let their shoulders down. And they can really connect. We offer a map on specifically around fatherhood, but a map for navigating the journey of fatherhood. And in a way, we really talk about our own inner world and connect. Why do people go to inns? Why do people go to taverns? Ultimately, it's to nourish, be nourished, find some skills and tools, connect and share stories, and maybe get some information from the shady guy in the corner over there, right? And so Journeyman is, I have a coaching program that I invite all fathers to be a part of. I live on social media, mostly on LinkedIn, and always have time in my schedule if someone reaches out and just wants to chat. Do that. I offer once a month. We do sort of an open house at the end kind of thing where there's a topic and then we just have conversations. All of that we can put in the notes. But I think most importantly is really, how do we start to reach out? And what I would say is, and invite anyone, if you want to reach out to me, I'll help you find someone local, or I will, invite you into our little program here. And so, what's really important is we start to change and evolve the story of masculinity together.
Beautiful. And my name's Mark Green. You can find me on most social media at Remaking Manhood. I have a book called The Little Me Too Book for Men. It maps the process by which boys' connection is broken, and then we're slotted into this dominance-based hierarchical masculinity, and it's 75 pages. It's a simple little read. You can find it on Amazon. If I'm going to leave with any single idea, leave you with any single idea, it is this: we are born to have connection. We are born to be in close, authentic, joyful, emotional connection with other human beings. And the idea that somehow we've been trained out of it by a culture or a system that wants us all to be in the pecking order, that's a very important idea to hold. So when you feel resistance to connection, to wanting to connect, when you feel that in yourself, know that that's not natural to you. That's what you've been trained and bullied and policed into over the course of your life. And when we finally say enough of that shit and break out of this man box culture and find connection, the very first thing that happens for us is all of this anxiety starts to dissipate and go away. And I wish each and every one of you, men, women, non-binary people, all of us, lives that are more connected and less full of this sense of isolation and anxiety.